I'd like to congratulate this platform itself because the quest for knowledge and knowledge of history for the young generation is really important. And my topic today is even more important in the context of the political scenario today because women's visibility is being problematized at this juncture of history, and we need to know the previous moments in history when women were invisibilized. So this is a tendency to invisibilize women throughout our human history. And today I will talk about some women who were effaced from the annals of history. And my book is my, point of argument. I would like to share. I don't know, Israt, you didn't even mention how much time I would get for this. Um, is it like half an hour or?
Ma'am, you can speak for more than 1 hour. We have reserved
Oh,
1 hour.
that's lovely. So I would share my slides today to introduce the topic. And can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Uh, so I want to talk about gendered modernity, and my references will be four Muslim women writers in early modern India, even though my book's title calls it pre-modern India. So I would first of all focus on the issue of modernity and how we conceptualize modernity. And modernity, how it is perceived in a postmodern world, is a problematic proposition. And it is quite difficult to define the modern self today, given the flexibility of the defining principles. So, Western modernity is my focus here, which is a way different from modernity in other parts of the world, including ours in South Asia. And that's why the admittance of global modernities is required in the discourse on the modern self. So, this admittance is specifically necessary while we explore the intersections of gender and modernity vis a vis lives of women in specifically non Western cultures, since it is implied by Western feminism that women's life is quote unquote essentially truncated in other parts of the globe. And today I want to argue that the parameter of modernity set by British colonial historians and their disciples in the Indian subcontinent is limited and prejudiced. And several components existed in the medieval period in the subcontinent that uh, surely would have been counted as modern had the Western bias not played a central role in the periodization of our history. My talk is more concerned, among other components of modernity, with writings of women that were bold expressions of self assertiveness and free thinking that are essentially modern. I call them modern. And based on the book, The Mughal Aviary, Women Writers in Pre-Modern India, I majorly focus on writings of royal women in Mughal India, which clearly evidence the progressiveness of these women and which was so far ignored in Western and post-independence Indian scholarship. Uh, I came to your program, the immediate previous one that you had with Aisha Jalal, because I was very interested uh, to listen to her. And she has, in her recent publication, which is titled Muslim Enlightened Thought in South Asia, claimed that Muslim Middle Ages in South Asia were equally, if not more, enlightened as Middle Ages in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And my argument today is that despite commuting and communicating within the limits of royal families, these four women writers I have mentioned in my book could intelligently expose their independent thinking apart from legitimizing the rule of their dynasties. And their literary exercises have major features of modernity, even by the European standard. And these women were never mere puppets, and the autonomy and power they exercised through their writings marked them as rebels in particular cases and inviting resultant penalty. And I argue that writings of these women defined their modernity, even though their contemporaries and subsequent generations failed to appreciate them. And here, my uh, modernity and postmodernity argument is quite visible. On the slide, you can see that postmodernity is a global, media influenced, fragmented, and sometimes it is even hyper real. It advocates that the institutions that modernity adhered to are no longer functional. And I'm talking from that point of view. Traditionally, how medieval ages, and especially women in the medieval ages, were considered as cultural and legal handicaps all over Europe that we know. And I have references of, these are my major points. I have references of two writers, indeed three. The first is The Legacy of the Middle Ages, edited by C.G. Crump and E.F. Jacob, and the other book, Medieval Women, edited by M.M. Poston. And there are several other volumes as well, which I haven't brought with me today, of critical writings that clearly testify the fact that with a contestation over territorial rights among the European nations, Europe was particularly hostile to the emergence of women's authority and sovereignty. So you can argue how those wonderful and very powerful English monarchs existed. That is, I think, a discussion for another day. But underneath their sovereignty, I guess there were lots of limitations, which I have discussed in my book, even referencing to Queen Elizabeth I. And this apparent authority and sovereignty, I think, are not all that we have to focus today. We have some other things to focus on. So, beginning with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century, the history of Europe is replete with warfare and bloodshed. Women hardly surface in this representation of patriarchal madness for power. And we also know about Joan of Arc, which is a curious one because this is a curious case because she somehow managed to challenge the united forces of masculine royalty and Orthodox religion. And as a consequence, her fall was inevitable. And in the words of Mary Erler and Marian Kowalski, that I have put here, the lines are here, women were mere chattels of their husbands and fathers because they were denied access to higher education and they were handicapped by legal systems. And this comment is also necessary for us to understand that the prevailing cultural attitudes of the Middle Ages considered women as the descendants of Eve, which is very interesting, intellectually and emotionally inferior to men, and thus incapable of wielding authority effectively. Women could not vote or run for public office, nor could they participate fully in other power structures such as the church, the military, or the guilds. So, in a general way, the indication of practical separation of domains of human activity is clear here. And by quote unquote other power structures, the systems of faith, military power, and the societal organizations are mentioned. Usually, women's emotional and intellectual inferiority is mapped by these standards. And as a student of literature and a researcher in cultural studies, my contention is for literary and cultural expressions that are needed to be considered as forms of power, because in my understanding, creation is power. And I also argue that this kind of generalization of power structures can be challenged only when an intimate and narrowed down history of the private sphere becomes available, and which is hardly the case of any of the European empires. Interesting. Orinoco, I have this reference of Orinoco by Afra Ben, is by far one of the rare and intimate fictional readings of British colonial empire that has challenged the legitimacy of it by narrating the psychic turnover of a slave who represents authority and sovereignty. Ben's work brings two important aspects to limelight. Number one, it is a woman who sees the underlying conflicts in a colonial patriarchal system and makes space for rebellion, of course, for the slave. And number two is it still remains the battle of masculine power, where Orinoco is inspired by a woman's love to challenge the hypocrisy of superior male power. And indeed, it also brings out the fact that fictional writings have been a strong weapon for such subversion of patriarchal power structures. But after all, these are fictional. Narratives of this kind that question the generalization of hierarchy and challenge colonial powers are readily available in more recent fictional writings, but factual evidences are indeed rare, especially in medieval Europe. And my contention for creative power of women in medieval India sprouts from my discovery of a historian in Mughal India who exposes the hidden truths behind power structures in one of the strongest dynasties in human history, that is, the Mughal Empire in Hindustan. And she is Gulbadan Begum. And in her Humayun Nama, she highlights how, underneath an apparently well made nexus of patriarchal dominion, women played a vital role where they not only wielded authority but also dared to play with it. The trajectory that comes out in this reading, nonetheless, is of the upper class, and to be specific, of the royal houses, which again cannot be generalized for all of Hindustani population. So the reading vis-a-vis my book on women writers, particularly who were part of the royalty in medieval India, tells us how medievalism and modernity merge in the writings of the women of that time. And my book is written from a post-colonial and intersectional feminist, uh, you know, inter- I call it intersectional because Western feminism could not actually uh, capture everything. So I think the sometimes modernity, when medievalism and modernity merge in the writings of the women, the intersectional feminist perspective that stresses the fact that straitjacketing women's life, and that too of Muslim women in medieval India, as truncated and mired in darkness, is a completely wrong notion. Modernity is, as traced in uh, Indian history, is also to be problematized because, following the colonial historians, literary modernism in India is counted by our historians with the collapse of the Mughal Empire in the middle of the 18th century, and particularly with the establishment of Fort William College in 1800 in Kolkata. That was Calcutta around that time. So, apart from freedom of thoughts, initiation into cultural resistance to colonialism is included in this sense of modernism. Progress of science, trade and commerce, as well as global geopolitical changes are not included in this trajectory because enlightenment of Europe covers that part of European history. The history of the subcontinent does not have that period of enlightenment demarcated, despite revolutionary inventions and progress of thoughts happening in this region, especially by in the hands of Muslims. And that too happened for quite a long time. But we don't have a particular period marked as the Enlightenment period of Indian subcontinent. In the scholars of history would know better. So, I'm sorry, I have to have this book. So, due to the absence of archiving and patenting methods, much of the indigenous knowledge of our region or the regions that remained outside of colonial exposure or the regions that remained on the fringes of the colonies lost their intellectual properties. On the one hand, this has been a reason for losing much of what we created locally and have embraced those very things when those were brought to us by the colonial forces. On the other hand, we never thought of collecting local intellectual treasures and creating our own routes of rediscovering the golden times of our history. And additionally, we tagged our pre colonial times as ages of darkness and Philistinism in the way the colonizers wanted us to see ourselves. While we see our own images in that mirror or lens provided by the colonizers, we are simultaneously being fed with the colonial ideologies that never liberated our minds. So, with this as the backdrop of the discussion, I would now focus on how Indian historians carry the legacy of colonial historiography. In the European scene, the early modern period begins in the 16th century and it lingers till the 18th. In the subcontinent, the term modern is used only with the association of British colonial power, and the immediate previous eras fall under pre modern or medieval times. And in the introductory chapter of my book, I have mentioned the Eurocentrism of Western historians and how, even in their own historiography, they have ignored the eastern part of Europe about which John Grevalloy Pocock writes. I quoted Pocock in my book, where Pocock says, let me check my book here. This is not only, though it is importantly a product of Western Arabs, it is also a product of the divided Western culture's deep need to understand itself. So Pocock saw it as a weakness, as a lacking. And India or South Asia actually never came into the global modernity narrative of the Europeans, as I mentioned in the book. Irfan Habib quite blatantly claims that the British historians wrote the history of India with, um, my book has this quote in page 4. Uh, Habib wrote, the British historians wrote the history of India with an avowed purpose of showing that all governments previous to the British had been despotic, intolerant, and monstrously cruel, and that the Indian people, ever divided, were fit only to be conquered and should be grateful that their last conquerors were so just and merciful. Talking about the colonizers. So, showcasing the post-colonial resistance as a marker of modernity, that's what I problematize today, which I did not much problematize in my book, but today I do it, is also this part of this Enlightenment project, and the Indian historians supported this idea. So, colonial enlightenment is obviously dominating this discourse. And my recent example is The Makers of Modern India by Ramchandra Guha, who speaks of leading figures, both men and women, playing key roles in the 19th century in unifying the educated class against colonial rules, and also illuminated the largest section of the society. So, Indian modernity in this book is equated with resistant and anti colonial thoughts, whereas modernism itself is rooted in the awakening of the self that never depended on the European conquest. Possessing and reflecting upon powerful ideas is a major indicator of modernity. And in India, there were writers who had such quality, who acquired such quality, I should say, much before the English education was introduced in the subcontinent. And uh, these are the women writers. I talk about in my book, and I claim that women's literary exercise is a form of power, which is not pronounced and recognized under the purview of historians like Ramchandra Guha. And this becomes my point of departure. And these four women I have discussed in my book, I call them gendered subalterns, whose modernity is their strength. Their modernity is gendered modernity that has crossed the limits of historiography, and we have here a curious amalgamation of historical pre-modernity that the book's title covers and literary modernism that the contents of my book actually talk about. So let's look at these women now. And now I would like to tell stories instead of theoretical discussion. This woman, Gulbadan Banu Begum, she existed from 1523 to 1603. She was the youngest daughter of Emperor Babur, who established the Mughal dynasty in the Indian subcontinent. Gulbadan lost her father after a few years after coming to India, and her brother, half brother Humayun, became the emperor. But then Humayun also uh, passed away quite quickly at a very young age. And then Gulbadan's nephew, the mightiest Mughal Akbar, ascended the throne. So the history of Humayun or Humayun Nama is written upon the request of Emperor Akbar because Akbar wanted Gulbadan to remember everything about his own childhood, his birth, his childhood, and his whole history till he became the emperor. Commissioned by the emperor, Gulbadan was, of course, it was a must for her. It was obligatory for her to write Humayun Nama. But when she wrote Humayun Nama, she actually gave Akbar as little space as possible. Only a few incidents, like Akbar's parents leaving him inside the tent when they fled, being driven away by the enemies. So Akbar was exposed as a lost child, as a child for whom his parents did not have much affection, much care. Why Gulbadan did that is, of course, a question. She did not like the way Akbar was trying to establish um, religion, a new kind of religious um, confluence. So she was quite annoyed with Akbar, and she also prayed to the emperor for her permission to depart for Mecca, where she would perform a pilgrimage and live the rest of her life. And Akbar did not allow that. Finally, he did, but he annoyed Gulbadan with long delay. So Gulbadan did not actually write about Akbar. She wrote about her half brother Humayun. The second writer I'm talking about is Jahanara, who was the eldest daughter of Emperor Shah Jahan, and she wrote two wonderful hagiographies. One was Munisul Arwa, which is the life and story of uh, Nizamuddin Aulia, Khaza Nizamuddin Chishti, and the second is Visalai Sahibia, who was Mullah Shah Badakshi, who was Jahanara's direct Sufi mentor. So these two biographies, these two hagiographies were supposed to, since we are talking about modernity here, we are also talking about anthropocentrism, which is a Renaissance phenomenon in Europe. You see, Jahanara brought it to these Mughal times in her through her writings, because Munisul Arwa and Risala-i Sahibia both, instead of being, uh, you know, worshipping the tradition of divine tradition, paying glorious tribute to the Sufi masters. Instead of doing that, she actually wrote about herself, her father, her brothers, even the struggle for the palace intrigues, the struggle for the throne. All these came into her writing, which were not supposed to come into this kind of writing. So she was talking much about her own self, calling herself a fakira, but she was always showing how headstrong she was, how she supported her eldest brother Dara Shiko and could not tolerate Aurangzeb. All these things are there in the hagiographies. So she kind of changed the writing style of hagiographies. She brought it to a more modern form where she kind of negated the idea of women being, erasing themselves. Self effacement is not Jahanara's forte here. My third writer is Zibun Nisa, who was the daughter of Emperor Aurangzeb and Jahanara's niece, and she was a poet. She wrote Diwani Makfi. She used to write rubais and ghazals, and her ghazals are interestingly very anthropocentric, very modern, talking about mundane love as well as divine love. And she is very brave, even though she is not blasphemous, but she is kind of crossing the limits of, you know, spiritual writing by connecting herself to Mansur Hallas, who was beheaded was for saying Anal Haq, I am God. So she is a daring character in this trajectory, and she was, because of all her, you know, uh, courage and boldness, she was imprisoned by her father, and she lived the last 20 years of her life uh, in the in Salimgarh fort where she died. And Zebunnisa's boldness is coming out. As I said, she was equating her own line of poetry with Mansur Halla's. Here, I have brought one instance. There are wonderful ghazals written by Zebunnisa, which you can find as published and translated into English. And here she is writing, my body and soul thirst for your love, and like Mansur, every grain of this dusty body cries, we are apart. You are all. We are divinity. So anybody can interpret this as a blasphemous comment when the writer is calling herself divine, calling herself equal to God. So she is the rebel among these four. And the final, the last writer is Habba Khatun. She was not actually part of the Mughal Empire. She was a Kashmiri. She was an ordinary peasant girl, but she married, it was her second marriage. She married Yusuf Shah Chak, the last free king of Kashmir. After defeating Yusuf Shah Chak, Akbar actually annexed the Mughal Empire and covered all of Kashmir. So Habba Khatun's second marriage, even though initially it was very empowering, it could not remain a happy one. After imprisoning Yusuf Shah Chak, Akbar proposed to Habba Khatun to leave Kashmir and stay with her husband, who was in imprisonment, but he was treated as a royal person. It was an open prison for them. Habba Khatun refused to accept this offer. So she left the palace and lived in a very small cottage by the river Jhelum and died there. She became very popular in her lifetime, and in the later periods, her songs were orally carried forward, and she's called the Nightingale of Kashmir. She's still very popular. And I know that Very recently, she has been included in the curriculum of University of Kashmir. She is being taught nowadays. And why am I calling these four women modern should be explained a little. So I find there several characteristics, several features in their writings. First of all is the self-assertion, which is a very modern phenomenon because individualism and identifying oneself as something, defining oneself is something that modernity always encourages. And their writings were self-assertive. They had, secondly, they had some kind of moral uprightness for which they could expose the truths of their own history. For example, Gulbadan Begum, when she writes about Humayun and his many wives, she narrates some intimate events when the wives are kind of competing with each other to grab the attention of Humayun and affection of Humayun. She is referring to the palace intrigues. She is also, referring to the uh, palace, how it was being involved, how the harem was being involved in decision making. Women were very empowered at that time. So the emperors used to come to the harem and they used to share their problems at the court with the women. And the women would always um, find good solutions to the issues. They would counsel the emperors. So they were connecting the home and the world here. They were taking decisions about outside matters. And all of their writings, especially the writings in the later period, writings in Sibunissa, for example, the sheer use of human energy, emotion, intellect, all these are making these writings rebellious and anthropocentric. All of these features are very modern. And I would finally, these are specific features of each of the writers. So this is Gulbadan who opened our vision uh, of a world of cruelty, intrigues, and killings. But she also gives an alternate history of the Indian subcontinent, where the Mughal emperors, I connect it with the new kind of Islamophobia that is emerging in the South Asian scene, where Islam is being connected to violence and bloodshed, where but through reading such memoirs, we can also see how the Muslim emperors were not only bloodthirsty emperors, they were helpless fathers, brothers, sons, and a new trajectory will open in front of us. We can see the essential human nature of these royal men who also became victims of their time, victims of their own power play. So I think that is also needed for extracting human sympathy for these emperors and powerful people. And Jahanara's self-fashioning, instead of talking about only the Sufi masters, she is talking about palace intrigues, talking about the uh, you know battle between the brothers, kind of giving her own support to one of them and not supporting the other. This kind of self-fashioning is also, showing her individualism. And she was a matriarch who kind of promoted the patriarchy, Mughal patriarchy, but she was also a designer of dynasty. She was an architect, as we know. She designed the Chandni Chowk in Delhi, Old Delhi, and she also wrote. So this kind of creative power is what makes her very modern in my views. Sebulnissa, I referred to her boldness already, and she was posing, she was adopting the style that male poets followed around that time and before her time. So she was a follower of Hafiz mostly, and the tradition of writing ghazals and rubais is actually a male tradition, which Jabunisa adopted, and she was kind of scared to do that as well because she had to write under the pen name of Makfi, which means the hidden, but she could not hide herself ultimately. So her father became a figure of oppression in her writings, and she has engaged herself in a dialogue with her father in many of these ghazals. And she cursed him for oppressing the soul of a powerless. So that kind of a rebellious statement that she could made at that time is something that makes her, unique in this period. And Habba Khatun's decision of not, uh, accepting the proposal of Akbar, who was very strong as an emperor, is something that also establishes her as a rebel. And I call uh, her voice as a moment of arrival in the history of Kashmir, because Kashmir has, you know, that kind of rebellious voice. Kashmir itself represents rebellion and oppression versus rebellion. This game is still there being played. And I would conclude today by referring to some modern critics who have gained interest in reading these women. One of them is Afshan Bokhari, who has written an essay, an extensive essay on these Mughal women, especially on Jahanara. And she calls their authorial selves, with their imperial male counterparts, she calls them major subsets within the broader category of historical writing that conveys a nuanced and textured understanding of the imperial and spiritual landscape and the place of women in this male dominated category. So that's how gendered modernity is being explained in my book. And my question, with this, I will end the talk today to the audience present here. How will you consider them? Will you consider them as modern or medieval?